Hi, good morning everyone. Once again, welcome to our Module 1 review. Again, kindly let me know if okay lang yung audio. And also in terms of like if there's anything weird with the screen, so dapat nag-update siya regularly. So kindly let me know. And then second, as I've shared with your classmates that have already been attending the review session, for me, um I think it's a bit nerve-wracking that there's only one day to go in terms of your first ever module exam. So I'm sure parang kinakabahan kayo on what to expect. But I think like what I mentioned in class, it's very similar to your quiz, and it's very similar in terms of like both the format and in terms of the complexity. So my only request would be that really make sure to watch this reviewer if you're scared, and be active in terms of listening. Meaning it's gonna be paulit-ulit, pero pag pinaulit-ulit ko, it means that it's super important to take note. And then if I tell you write this down or memorize this, I do hope that you take the suggestion to give you the best fighting chance in terms of the exam, right? So again, it's two things lang naman in terms of the exam. Number one, we really have to memorize theory, or if hindi nyo kayang i-memorize, really understand where they're coming from, and then be able to strategically answer your multiple choice questions and your short problems, right? And then number two is really in terms of solving the problems. I'm telling you now, magugulat kayo dun sa format, dun sa exam questions. In the same way na nagulat kayo siguro in terms of like the format for the quiz. Now, the idea here is that even though nagulat kayo dun sa format, you'll be able to answer it in such a way that you're able to bring it back dun sa alam nyo or dun sa pinag-aralan natin dun sa problem set. The assurance here is that everything that we've discussed in problem sets, everything that I'll be discussing in today's review, dapat magbi-build siya so that you can really answer the short problems or the long problems that will come your way. But the reminder ko talaga for everyone is don't be intimidated with the questions. Every short problem, just always go back to ano ba yung tinatanong nung question. And then, based on ano yung tinatanong, ano yung problem set na similar or makakatulong sa akin, right? So, those are my tips. And basically, to summarize, in solving during the exams, it's really the panicking. So number one, please be early tomorrow para hindi kayo ngarag in terms of like the time. Number two, kapag hindi nyo alam, then skip. Then go to the another portion, right? Pero never leave your exam sheets blank. So I'm not saying na parang there will be ano, pero it just works best na you try your best na in each and every question that you may have, right? So if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand or DM me sa chat. And then just let me know. Yeah, sorry. So I'll just keep that here. So with that said, expectation settings. How will you make the best out of this? So on my perspective, it's a very comprehensive exam. Technically, parang this is like a semester's worth of parang high school accounting. But I will try my best to summarize both the theory and also everything that will give you your arsenal in terms of answering your short problem. Meaning, my mindset is if you're coming here na you think you're gonna get like a 10 out of 100 or like a 0 out of the 100 in the exam, and then you feel like wala na kayong time to redo all of the exercises. The purpose of this is to be more of a quality over a quantity review. I will just be identifying ano ba yung mga parang mga landmark problems that would encapsulate all the learning into one problem. And yun sa theory, parang just to really summarize to you, ano yung mga important points. So with that said, it needs to be active in such a way that parang treat it as if you're listening to the lecture for the first time. So take note of all of the things that I'll be emphasizing. Redo all the exercises. So given the time, I can only go through it and then ask you if okay or nagets nyo ba. And then please be honest kung hindi nyo nagets, that's the time na pwede kong ulitin. So yun yung advantage for attending. But for those that are watching the recording, please make sure na you redo the exercises that's presented on this slide, or at least the ones na I recommend from this slide. Just so that kung nagpapanik kayo on you don't know what to answer, you go for quality. Meaning, answer it not because sinundan nyo lang yung how I answered it, but because naiintindihan nyo yung underlying framework for that, right? So with that said, that's enough of the reminders. Let's now jump into our long exam review, right? So basically, it's comprised of 4 chapters. And the very first chapter is really more conceptual and theoretical compared to the other 3. So for chapter 1, what I really want you to be masters at would be to understand the overall context of accounting and know by heart yung mga important accounting principles and the fundamental framework concepts, right? So meaning, ano ba yung nagpapahirap sa atin for the whole semester? It's really the overarching idea of what is accounting, right? And basically, in terms of our first lecture, we've mentioned that accounting, honestly, it looks very complicated. It looks very complex because everything that will happen to a business will finally go to in terms of like an accounting if it's an economic event. But at the end of the day, we're just doing 3 things in terms of accounting. We're identifying which transactions to record. 2, knowing that it's an economic event and not a personal event, that's when we're able to record through the use of what? Journal entries. So you create your journal entries so that it's the formal documentation of your economic events. And then you classify and summarize them into T accounts. That's the informal version, or your ledger. So your ledger, again, compared to your trial balance, to your worksheet, your ledger will give you the summary of changes per account. So think your T account. So ano ba yung binibigay ng T account natin? It's one account, like cash. It will give you your beginning balance and your ending balance. So a ledger is just a more formal version of it. So a ledger is the summary of changes. And then ultimately, we can then parang communicate what's happening. Meaning, through our help of our financial statements. So there are 4. So you have your statement of cash flows, pero sa 99.2 pa yan. You have your income statement, na ang major goal ng income statement is to give you your net income. Your changes in equity, which is the major goal niya, is to give you your ending owner's capital. And then, yung statement of financial position, na ang major goal niya is to prove to you that your assets is equal to your liabilities plus equity. So, please take note that accounting is not bookkeeping. It's very different. Bookkeeping is just one part of accounting, right? So now that that's clear, the next portion that we're gonna be doing is that, like what I've mentioned, accounting is only as useful as the information it presents. So out of everything, the first thing that I want you to be experts at or even memorize would be your 2 fundamental qualitative characteristics and your 4 enhancing qualitative characteristics. So yung 2 fundamental, these are essential, and then yung 4, it just enhances. Now, in terms of your quiz 1, meron pa rin nagkakamali. So please take note na RR yung fundamental, relevant, and reliable. Again, the 2 fundamental are relevant and reliable. Or kung hindi reliable, faithful representation. Okay? So again, the 2 would be either relevant or reliable and faithful representation. So, ganun yung titingnan nyo. So those are the fundamental. Now, how do you describe these fundamental? For it to be relevant, it has to be material. So the understanding the concept of materiality, that if you know an information about something and it changes your decision, then that's relevant. That's material. So pag reliable, it is faithful representation. So it's complete, neutral, and free from error. On the other hand, paano nyo memorize yung enhancing? VCUT, right? So verifiable, comparable, understandable, and timely. So not only is it important for you to memorize, but also know which characteristic I'm talking about. So for example, If it's comparable, what it essentially does is that it enables you to be consistent and you understand similar and differences between the companies that you're comparing. If it's verifiable, that means that you have different experts reaching a consensus na, okay, tama naman pala yan. That's verifiable. And then understandable is parang naiintindihan siya ng mga people that actually use the data. And then finally, timely, meaning that you need the information at the time that will really impact your decision making, right? So again, our fundamental would be relevant or materiality. So relevant or materiality and reliable and faithful representation, right? So now, the next question is, okay, we understand that information is useful. The next thing that I want you to be experts at would be, who are your users? So please know the distinction between managerial accounting and financial accounting. So again, managerial accounting is for internal users. Managerial is for internal, meaning that's for your CEO, CMO, CFO, your managers, anyone that will make internal decisions are under managerial accounting. On the other hand, the one that we're studying here in 99 is financial accounting. This is for external users. So external is financial accounting. So kindly take note also, not necessarily memorize, but just know, sino ba yung mga external stakeholders? You have your investors, your creditors, your government agencies, your customers, your labor unions. So I leave it up to you to understand ano yung mga information that they'll want in terms of the external. But the major point that I want to make is, if it's internal users, it's managerial accounting. If it's external users, it's financial accounting. Now, in terms of the theory, ano pa yung mga kailangan alam nyo? For me, important that you also know ethics, right? Honor and excellence. So first is, kailangan alam nyo rin yung code of ethics. So if VCUT is for you to help in terms of the for enhancing, and RR is for reliable and relevant for fundamental, the next thing that I want you to really know would be the code of ethics of professional accountants. That at the end of the day, they should be acting in public interest. So ano yung mga essential characteristics of an accountant? So bago natin alamin pa yung mga what we need to do, ang importante is the strength of their character, right? So every accountant should have PIC-OC. They should have professional behavior, they should have integrity, they should have confidentiality, they should have objectivity, and they should have professional competence and due care. So again, my homework for you is not only to know and understand each of every one of this, but also to understand or be able to classify pag may scenario, ano bang kind of characteristic yon, right? So meaning, if the accountant is straightforward and honest, then that's probably a sign of integrity. If they maintain professional knowledge and continuing education, then that's probably professional competence and due care, right? So please also be familiar in terms of the things that you need to know. So aside from knowing the character, it's important to know also that there are standards. The reason why accounting is very important is because we can compare kahit na different entities, meron kasing underlying standard that, as the name suggests, standardizes the rules. And for us, ang tinitingnan natin now is the General Accepted Accounting Principles, or GAAP. So that may ensure natin na pare-pareho yung treatment. So other things is like syempre yung measurement principle, like historical cost and fair value. But another thing that really you need to focus on is to understand ano ba yung mga key assumptions natin. So there are four. So there are four key assumptions for us to be able to operate on a daily basis as accountants, right? So these four form the building blocks. So I really want you to understand all of these concepts. That number one, we operate on what we call a going concern assumption. So basically, ang sinasabi lang nito is that it assures you that the entities na ginagawa natin ng financial statements, they won't go bankrupt tomorrow. They won't go bankrupt next month. They're not gonna go bankrupt next year. The underlying assumption is that the entity will continue in operation for the foreseeable future. So as the name suggests, they are a going concern. They're gonna keep on running. Right? Next, monetary unit just means that for any economic event, kailangan may nakakabit na amount. So going back to your journal entries, there are two things lang naman na you need to be experts about in any sort of journal entry. Number one, what are your debits and your credits? Meaning, ano yung mga accounts affected? And then number two, paano mo isosolve yung monetary unit? Kaya, monetary unit just sets that only transaction data expressed in terms of money shall be included in the accounting record. And then finally, the third would be economic entity na sinasabi na me as a person, if I own a business, that business is a separate economic entity. So dito papasok yung concept of owner's drawings. So kukuha ako ng pera dyan. Pero pag nakuha ko na yung pera, and then gumastos ako, bumili ako ng clothes for a trip, dapat hindi na magre-reflect kay economic entity because they are separate and distinct from the owner. And then finally, we have time period assumption na I'll go back to when it comes to our chapter 3 kasi dyan naman papasok si accruals and deferrals. So, at this point, are there any questions or clear pa naman yung theory? So basically, theory, nag-iipon lang tayo ng theory points right now. So kindly thumbs up if everything's okay, and then I'll proceed na to just a quick recap of what we've discussed yesterday. Okay, clear. So next, the next thing that we need to know for chapter 1, and the most important thing, is that we need to understand that assets or everything that your business owns has to come from somewhere. It has to be either a liability or lent by a third party or put up by the owner. So in essence, ang sinasabi lang natin is that assets is equal to your liabilities and equity. So please, yung first kong pakiusap sa inyo would be that if kuwari, dalawa lang of the three accounting equations is binigay, automatically solve for the third. So kuwari, in the given, binigay lang assets and liability, automatically solve for your equity. If yung liability, wala, solve for your liability kagad. Or kuwari, liability and equity yung binigay, solve for your assets kagad. Just to provide you with enough context in terms of answering that question. So in chapter 1, we're coming in blind. We don't know what journal entries are, pero we do know that there are economic events happening. So as a tool, ang sinabi lang namin sa inyo is that you can analyze the transactions in such a way that we can prove to you that in every economic event, kailangan balance siya. In accounting, ang importante is mag-balance yung assets mo equals to your liabilities and your equity. And if there's one landmark problem that you can go back to, it would be the Macy Consulting. So for me, rather than parang resolving it, I think what you need to understand here is that for every economic event, kailangan balance siya. So again, going back to our discussion yesterday, pag tumaas yung asset because you've invested cash, tataas si equity. So asset increase, equity increases. On the other hand, kuwari, naka-receive ka ng money. So, pero from an accounts receivable. So, ang mangyayari, tataas si cash, bababa si accounts receivable. So, you have an increase in your asset, but an equal decrease. So, the balance remains the same. Finally, nag-borrow ka ng money. So, tumaas si cash, pero tumaas si liability. So, as you can see, it's the same that in the sense that tumaas yung asset mo, pero in order to balance, either tumaas si equity, or tumaas si liability, or may bumabang asset. So the idea lang here is that the magic of accounting is that for every economic event, babalanse yan. That assets is equal to your liabilities plus equity. So, the first, if Macy Consulting is the first landmark case, the second one that I want you to revisit would be the bear scenario. So again, I think I already repeated um in the in the discussion after your quiz, pero just in case parang you weren't able to absorb, ang importante for me for chapter 1 is the framework that there is a beginning, assets is equal to your liabilities and equities, that's your beginning balance. You have your ending balance, and then you have your change. And then, ang sinasabi ko lang is that after you know the framework, plug in mo lang. So, binigay yung assets, binigay yung equity. So, naturally, isosolve mo yung liability. Then, you can solve downwards. So, how do I get the ending balance? If I know that the beginning balance of assets is 1.5 and the change is 250. Well, ang mangyayari dyan would be that I just add. So, 1.5 million plus 250,000 would be, that should be 1.750. And then for this, it's 677 minus 77 is 600,000. So I'll just make that correction now. So you have 1.750. There. So you have 1.750 here and then 600. So this means that I'll be able to solve this by, if our assets is 1.750, then my liabilities would be 1.750 minus 600. That will give you 1,115,000, and then ultimately it will give you your change. Now your 823,000 is increased by 327,000 para naging 1,115,000. So again, ang common mistake is pababa lang tong change na to. Meaning, if you go to, ito yung original birth, pero if you go to the other company, which is the Bear Ltd, ang binigay naman sa inyo is the ending balance. So it changed na parang less, the beginning balance decreased by 500,000. So rather than subtracting 4 million by 500, that's wrong. Since pataas siya, the opposite effect happens. So it should be 4 million plus 500,000 should give you your 4.5 million. And then in terms of your equity, since the beginning balance increased by 150 to make your ending balance 1.85 million, what we need to do is to get the beginning balance is 1.85 million minus 150,000 to get you your 1.7 million. And then, just complete the equation to get your 6.2 million, and then alam mo yung change. If it's 6.2 in the beginning, naging 5.85, there was a decrease of 350,000. So, please be aware lang of this first framework. So, the Bear Ltd, I'll leave it up to you to be experts at this. So, Macy Consulting to understand, Bear Ltd for you to resolve. Next, yun yung simple format. Assets plus liabilities, assets is equal to your liabilities plus equity. But we know that there's an expanded accounting equation where equity is further subdivided into owner's capital, which in this case means your additional investments for that period, your net income or your net loss, pero usually binabasag natin yung net income and net loss to revenue and expense. So pareho lang yun ha. Net income or net loss is just your revenue and your expense summed up together. So owner's capital, revenue, expense, and your owner's drawings. So after the Bear, revisit accountant ang, right? And yung importante dito is I want you to focus on the change in equity for the year. So I think this one we already discussed yesterday, so we can pick another one just to highlight. So for this, the Air Nation, the first step is for you to complete the beginning balance. So kindly take note, this is the beginning balance. Sorry, nasa na ba yun? Arrow. Yeah, this is the beginning balance, and then this is the ending balance, right? So now the first step is let's complete equity. So 870,000 minus 356 will give you 514,000 as your beginning entity. Beginning equity. So if your beginning equity is 514,000 and naging 689,000 on the other hand, ano yung change in equity? Our change in equity would therefore be an increase. So let's solve using a calculator. So gumawa tayo ng calculator. So 689,000 minus 514, 175,000. So 175,000 yung in-increase niya. So the expectation is that if I add the owner's capital minus owner's drawings plus revenue minus expense, it should total 175,000. Now may missing piece. Hindi natin alam kung ano si owner's capital. So anong gagawin natin? The easiest way is for us to add muna the given. So minus 24,000 plus 47 revenue minus 19 na expense will give you 4,000. Currently, 4,000 na positive lang yan. Paano natin papataasin yung 4,000 all the way to 175,000? Well, by common math, we need an additional 175 minus 4, 171,000. So your owner's capital mo is 171,000. So again, just to highlight the point, let's go to here. In Earth, your beginning equity is 33,000. Your ending equity is 33,000. The change for the year is 0. Meaning, your owner's capital minus your owner's drawings plus your net income or minus your net loss should be equal to 0. So itong apat na component sa baba should be equal to 0. So again, how do you solve for the missing? To solve for the missing, all you have to do is add the given 9,800 for owner's capital plus revenue of 150,500 plus minus 40,300 gives you 120,000. So in order for you to zero out 120,000, you need an owner's drawing equal to that amount. So negative or minus 120,000 owner's drawings. So for chapter 1, yun pa lang naman yung kailangan yung maging experts. So again, common mistakes, plugging in the wrong information. Be careful at looking the dates. Please double check kung sino yung beginning balance, sino yung ending balance per number. Mag-iiba yan, it's time pressured, pero sayang yung effort nyo kung mali lang yung plug-in nyo. Number 2, please review your changes in the year. Means pag pababa, you follow it. Pag pataas, you don't. You go the opposite. So review the table if it makes sense. Right? So as pag may time kayo mag-review, yun yung kailangan yung review. And with that, we're officially done with chapter 1. Right? We're done with our transaction analysis roadmap. We know how to analyze per economic event kung mag-i-increase ba or decrease. We know na eventually it will become our 3 financial statements. The next step is now knowing how to record, right? So knowing how to record for the process. So at this point, do you have any questions or everything is clear pa so far? So tatlo yung cases na I mentioned. The 3 cases would be Macy Consulting, The Bear Ltd, and Accountant Ang. Right? Are there any questions or everything is okay? Kindly give me mga 1 minute lang just so that I can take a break. I'll get water lang. But kindly DM me within like 1 minute if you have questions. So kindly give me around 1 minute. Okay. So right now, 0 DM. So that's good. We're 1/4 down, right? So that means na 1/4 of the exam, everything's clear pa so far, right? So now the next step is, okay, alam na natin the effects, whether it will be an increase or a decrease on a particular amount. But how do we actually record these accounts? So dito, in chapter 2, pumasok yung concept of debits and credits. Again, debits and credits just means left and right. Left and right of what? Left and right of your accounts. Meaning, for every asset, liability, and equity, you have different accounts. Under assets, you'll have your cash all the way until your property, plant, and equipment. Your liabilities, you'll have your AP all the way to your notes payable. And then your equity, alam na natin yan in terms of our statement of changes in equity. These are just your owner's capital, owner's drawings, your income, and your expenses. And the idea in chapter 2 is that your debits or your left side should equal your credits. And therefore, we manipulated the expanded accounting equation na nilipat natin si expense and si owner's drawings on the left side. Bakit ulit natin sila nilipat? Because on the right side, it was liabilities plus owner's capital plus revenue minus expense minus owner's drawings. So we wanted to make them positive. So nilipat lang natin sila to the left. And therefore, we'll able to make sure na alam natin yung left and yung right natin. Right? So meaning, ang normal account for our assets, expenses, and owner's drawings are debit. And ang normal account ng liabilities, owner's capital, and revenue are credit. And ano ulit yung definition ng normal account? Ano ulit yung normal account? It's the side where it increases. Again, ano ulit yung definition ng normal account? It's the side where it increases. Meaning, pag debit asset, that means it's an increase in asset. If it's a debit owner's drawings, it's an increase in owner's drawings. If it's a credit in owner's capital, so please, ito yung pinaka-important. You understand owner's capital. Credit of owner's capital means it increased. So probably that's a net income. A debit in owner's capital is a net loss because that will decrease. So again, a normal account is the normal portion of that account is where the side it increases, right? So now, we now go to kung ano yung kailangan or bread and butter nyo in accounting. And that would be your journal entries. So the idea lang here is that in journalizing, it's the formal entry of a transaction to a journal. So meaning one economic event, one given, probably one journal entry. The only time na hindi tayo mag-journal entry is if hindi siya economic event, right? And the crucial part of a journal entry is that it's a double entry accounting system. And again, paulit-ulit, pero the double entry does not mean na one debit lang and one credit or two credits and two debits. What's important is that the total monetary amount of your debit is equal to your total monetary amount of your credit. So in this example, dalawa yung debit natin, isa yung credit natin, but equal sila. 250 plus 400 is equal to the credit of 650,000. Maintaining the balance. So the idea lang here is that this is an example of a compound journal entry, meaning it involves 3 accounts. But the idea here is that your total debits should equal your total credits. So with that said, the one thing that you really need to be experts by now, and hindi ko naman na uulitin, is that dapat this should come second nature to you. So the debit credit matrix, right? So now, other theory portions. So again, what is a ledger? A ledger is just a summary of changes, and it has to be performed in chronological order so that it's just comprising all debits and credits of one entry. So for this ledger, may ledger lang tayo for cash. Lahat lang ng cash accounts, right? So in summary, Journalizing is a formal documentation of what's happening. So from an economic event, you make a journal entry. And then to track the changes, you have an account ledger or a T account para lang alam mo kung ano yung ending and beginning balance and the changes for this, right? So now, the newest tool na we introduced in chapter 2 is your trial balance. Now, ilan ba yung versions ng trial balance na matututunan natin for the accounting? We have the first trial balance, which you will do after you do your normal entries. You have your adjusted trial balance, which you will do after adjusting. And you have your post-closing trial balance that you will do after closing. But punta muna tayo dun sa simplest form. And the simplest form, ang ginagawa lang ng trial balance is that it's a list of accounts and balances at a specific point of in time, right? So, mini-make sure lang niya that your debits is equal to your credits. So, coming in to our financial statements, again, in terms of the headers, see statement of income statement, and see statement of changes in owner's equity covers a period in time. Kaya it's for the month ending. It's for the year ending. On the other hand, take this note, trial balance, financial position, or balance sheet are a snapshot in time. Meaning, dapat it's as of a particular date, right? So, if you want a more visual representation, you can go back to lecture 1.5 where we use the analogy of a person climbing to show you na for income statement and changes in owner's equity, it's over a period of time. For financial possession, and now for trial balance, it's a snapshot. So it's an as of date. So now, the trial balance, using the trial balance, will give you your three statements. So you have your income statement sa baba, your changes in owner's equity in one owner's capital account, and then you have your balance sheet sa taas, right? So, ano yung learning natin sa quiz number 1? Huwag kayong matakot sa trial balance. Kapag merong mga, pare, papaiba sa inyo yung mga accounts, hindi siya nag-balance. If may tanong na net income, be confident na, okay, baka naman wala namang affected na revenue or expense account. So I can still get my income statement. So know where to look sa trial balance on how to get the income statement. So the fourth landmark study na I want you to try would be yung high rule service, right? So high rule service. So that's for chapter 2. So let's test our mastery, right? So now for this portion, this is just basically a review of quiz 1. I know yesterday parang a lot of people were still confused. So uulitin ko again for one last time para lang you know how to strategically answer. So for statement 1, basically statement 1 is true because ito lang yung textbook definition. And then we know that bookkeeping is not just another name. It's just particular to the recording. So ang tama lang is statement 1 is true, statement 2 is false. Number 2, which among the following is the least tied to the fundamental characteristic of reliability? So, reliability talks about ano yung mga important concepts of reliability? Faithful representation, complete, neutral, free from error. From there, alam nyo na ang pinaka-least here would be materiality. Sorry. So the correct answer here should be materiality. So number 2, ang pinaka-least tied to it would be materiality. So that would be materiality refers to the relevant. So for this, let's do the typo. We'll fix lang the typo this time. So again, sorry for this. Which one is the least tied to reliability? It's materiality, because materiality is to relevance, right? So the idea lang is in memorizing your fundamental and qualitative and enhancing characteristics, you need to be able to understand ano yung mga specific information about them. Number 3, which of the following is most likely to use managerial accounting? Meaning, I want you to interpret this question automatically na, okay, managerial accounting is internal. So, sino yung out of the 4 is an internal user, right? And basically, again, sorry, the answer here would be project managers concerned about the internal reports. So, mali lang yung naka-highlight. So here, the answer here would be the project managers, right? So pag managerial accounting, it should be the project managers, right? So project managers are the ones most likely to use the managerial accounting. Next, for the total equity of Alan Inc., basically, this is just a simple assets is equal to your liabilities and equity. The thing lang that got a lot of people in this multiple choice question is that first thing that you have to do is to plot out 246,000 on the equity portion. And then it says that its liabilities are equal to 2/5 of its total assets. So 2/5 is roughly are equal to 40%. So ang liabilities natin is 40%. Therefore, ang equity natin is 60% and 100% is your asset. Kasi, so another way of looking at it is if liabilities is 40%, your assets should be 100%. So 100% minus 40% is 60%. So if alam nyo na that 246,000 is 60% of asset, how do you solve for total assets? The correct answer is 410,000. The way to do it is just 246 divided by 60% or 0.6 will give you 410. Kaya ang tamang answer dito is total assets. So, in instances like this, nagkakamali lang yung mga tao because you need to plug it in equity and then you have to read it properly. Na yung 2/5 refer to the liability. So you have to solve na yung equity is 3/5 or 60%. And then it's just 246,000 divided by 60% is equal to 410,000. So which of the following events should not be recorded? Obviously, yung nag-owner's drawings ka na, may pera ka na, pero it's a personal transaction. Right? So C is the wrong, so should not be recorded. Number 6, accounts that have normal balances on the debit side are, basically this is just elementary. It's assets, expense, owner's drawings. So basically that's D. Number 7, to uphold the double entry accounting system, journal entries must have only one debit and one credit. So that's wrong. Kailangan lang your total debits is equal to your total credits. Number 2, an erroneous entry where rent was paid was recorded as 4,400. So nagkaroon ng error. Instead of 44,000, 44,400 yung nilagay. But in terms of determining mahuhuli ba ng trial balance ang error, you have to understand kung it affected both the debit and the credit side. For this case, kahit na mali yung 4,400, naapektuhan si debit, naapektuhan si credit, so it will still balance. Meaning, the trial balance will not be able to detect that error. Therefore, the correct answer is statement 2 is true. 4,400 debit, 4,400 credit, it will still balance. Ang mali is statement 1. Number 8, multiple choice. So number 8 was designed for us to test you kung magaling ba kayo gumawa ng compound journal entry. Now, yung panghuli dito or the trap is tatlo yung desk and then ang binigay sa inyo is each. So again, be careful of the word each or total, especially kung more than one yung tinutukoy. So how do you solve for this? So number 1, is you try to understand. The journal entry for buying 3 company standing desks costs 120 each. Meaning, it should be 120 since each times 3, it will give you 360,000. What's 360,000? That should be a debit for equipment because equipment increased. Now, what's the next component? Paano niya binayaran yung 360,000 na equipment? Sabi, 20% in cash, 80% through what? 80% through probably may obligation siya to pay. So that's gonna be 20% cash, 80% accounts payable. So with that said, the next step is, paano natin malalaman yung cash? Well, ang cash would be 360,000 times 0.2 will give you a cash of 72,000. And then, yung remainder, which is basically 360,000 minus 72,000 or 80% is 288,000. So, credit cash, 72,000. Credit accounts payable of 288,000. So, basically, yun lang yung answer for multiple choice number 8. Multiple choice number 9. Ledger is the summary of changes in balance of each account, right? And then which error cannot be detected by a trial balance? Again, in terms of doing the trial balance, the idea lang is, if the data error affects both sides, hindi siya madedetect ni trial balance. A, only affected credit. B, affected debit na hindi na record. Encoded twice in the trial balance. So basically, those are things na will be detected, right? So now, we're done with the multiple choice. So by then, supposedly, you were able to get 10 points. And then, Wes Anderson was also supposed to give you 20 points. So 30. So dapat ang mahirap dun sa quiz 1 was supposedly the trial balance. So for this, I leave it up to you to redo this. Pero for me, doon sa mga nahihirapan pa mag-journal entry, there are hints to the transaction event that will tell you what needs to happen. If may invested, that's obviously owner's capital, cash, so debit cash, credit owner's capital, 120,000. That will always be the journal entry for investing to a business. Kapag nag-borrow ka sa bank, obviously, that would always be debit cash, credit notes payable for the amount you borrowed, 180,000. Now, for this journal entry, ito yung what I emphasized kanina, and we already did the exercise on how do you do this kind of entry. You first determine kung yung amount na binigay sa'yo is each or total. For this, 3 drying racks, total 51,000. So, debit equipment, 51,000. Every time may compound journal ethics equipment, it's always about paano niya binayaran. So your credit portion will always be credit cash, credit accounts payable. So please just memorize this types of transactions kasi alam niyo naman yung dapat journal entry here. So now, 51,000. So how did we get 17,000? We got 17,000 by just doing this. If 51,000 is the total, divide mo by 3, that should give you 17,000. So you paid 17,000 in cash, 1/3 of the amount, and then 51,000 minus 17 is 34,000. So para lang mag-balance si debits and si credits. So ganun lang. On the other hand, ano pa yung compound journal entry? Kapag nag-perform ka ng service, pero hindi ka pa binayaran ng buo. So, ang mangyayari dito is credit service revenue. So, credit service revenue. Pero ano yung mga natanggap mo? Nakatanggap ka ng cash na 80,000. So, ano pa yung remaining? May butas. 80 yung debit mo. 180 yung credit mo. What's your missing debit? It's an accounts receivable. So, please, for Hyrule Services and for the Wes Anderson in your quiz, bantayan nyo yung mga compound journal entry. It would never change. It's the same. Hyrule, Wes Anderson, iniba lang yung the way we phrased it, the way that the amounts are now, but the same journal entries for the similar types of transactions. So, ang homework nyo for chapter 2, redo Hyrule Services, redo the Wes Anderson, make sure mabilis kayo gumawa ng journal entries. And then ito, straightforward. Kapag na-charge ka ng bill, the first question mo is, binayaran ko ba in cash? If not yet, then that's just gonna be debit utilities expense, credit utilities payable. You owe something kasi wala ka namang cash na binigay. And then same with your assistants. So pag nagbayad ka each, so 32,500 times 2, you have debit salaries, wages, and expense 65,000. Cash of 65,000. So ito, binayaran mo na kasi sila. Kaya wala kang utang. And then finally, for the rent, again, you straight out paid for it. Pero bakit hindi siya prepaid rent? Because it's January 31. You're paying for January rent. So na-consume mo na. Therefore, it's a straightforward rent expense, credit cash of 88,000. So before I proceed, everything clear with journal entries for problem 1? Kindly thumbs up if everything's clear so that I can proceed na to the next question. So again, for journal entries, what we need to do is do your Hyrule Services and your Wes Anderson. Next, the next question is, huwag kayong masatisfy na tama yung journal entries nyo. To really get perfect, the one that separates people that pass, so tatlo lang naman yan eh. Either you fail, you pass, or you do really well. The people that fail are those that don't know the journal entries. Meaning, kung mali na yung journal entries nyo, you probably have parang minimal chance of answering or interpreting the questions. So those are the people that fail. Kaya importante sa akin is you redo the exercises that I've mentioned here. Number 2, the people that pass are those that know how to make the journal entries. So tama yung pag-analyze nila. Number 3, the people that do well are the people na after ng journal entries, they can analyze it. Right? So here, like what I mentioned kanina, huwag kayong kabahan. Always go back to your T accounts. So, kung hinahanap lang is total liabilities, the only thing you have to do is look at your journal entries and then tingnan nyo, ano yung liability? Notes payable, accounts payable, and utilities payable. And that's how you're able to determine your total liabilities. So, like what I've mentioned, maraming ihihingi sa inyo yan. Tatanong sa inyo, what's the total cash? Or probably, what's the total supplies? Or probably, what's the total current assets? Or what's the total revenue? What's the total non-current asset? What's the total current liability? What's the total non-current liability? What's the total owner's equity? The point is, as long as you're an expert in your classified financial position, meaning alam nyo kung paano i-classify ano yung current assets, ano yung non-current assets, ano yung current liabilities, ano yung non-current liabilities, ano yung owner's equity, you don't have to worry about total balance questions. That's what I call them, total balance questions. All you have to do is look at your journal entry and then see ano ba yung mga nag-a-affect for that particular amount, right? So, thing that you have to memorize and really master, what are your classified financial position? Ano yung mga current assets nyo? Cash, AR, supplies, prepaid expenses. Non-current asset, please make sure na you have accumulated depreciation under non-current asset. Current liability are your accounts payable all the way until your interest payable. Non-current liability, you have your notes payable. And then finally, you have your equity. So, jumping a bit ahead, pero I want you to do Sensei Golf Range. So again, this is another reminder for the people that are looking to get bonus points. You can submit your problem set 4 to me before the exam tomorrow. My suggestion is, if nag-abol kayo ng points and you want a big increase without doing the whole, just submit me Sensei Golf Range na you're able to do the proper financial position na ito. You can copy it and then get the bonus points. Okay lang yun sa akin. Tulong ko na yun sa inyo. But more importantly, I really want you to know how to classify each of them. So please promise me na you'll be able to know how to classify accounts into current assets, non-current assets, current liabilities, non-current liabilities, and owner's equity. It will take too long for me to go back to this. So my suggestion is, if you want a more comprehensive discussion on this, watch lecture 4.2. So basically yung me answering it during the reading break. So basically, ang sinasabi ko lang here is that if tinatanong sa inyo mga total cash, total supplies, etc., etc., just break the problem, look at the journal entries that will help you solve for that item, right? So yun lang yung tip ko for questions like that. So finally, the last problem for long problem 2 would be Fearless Ballet Studio. So given the time, the idea lang here is, so aside from Fearless Ballet, you can do Hype Boy Studio also. That's also on your problem set. Parehong-pareho yung problem. Iniba lang yung process. So again, for these types of questions, all you have to do would be determine what is the error made, what should be the correct treatment, and then pag error, ang ginagawa lang natin is correct the wrong, make the right. So reverse the wrong, make the right. So for this, yung first mistake niya was dinebit raw niya si drawings. Ay, kinredit raw niya si drawings. So now, yesterday, may nagtanong sa akin, bakit natin i-increase si debit ng 7,000 to correct that wrong? Because I was telling them na, imagine nyo, yung owner's drawings before, so let's say, we have an owner's drawings before the mistake that was given. The first question here is, what is the normal account for owner's drawings? Hindi ba siya debit? So probably, ang kwento niyan is may 37,000 ka na debit. Then you made the error. Nag-credit ka ng 7,000. So, kaya naging 30,000 siya. So a credit to the normal balance of an owner's drawings na debit of 30,000 means nabawasan yan. So ang correct entry for owner's drawing is 37,000. So kailangan to bring that back, 37,000 dapat si owner's drawings. And then yung sa second part, yung sa owner's capital, kailangan mong i-credit tong 42,500. So in essence, what will happen would be magiging 37,000 and 49,500. So that's the first error now we were able to correct. Right? So, yeah. So now we can increase. Okay. So we're done with that. The next step is the second one. So the second one, another wrong lang is, hindi lang niya nagawa yung journal entry. And paulit-ulit, napapansin nyo paulit-ulit yung compound journal entry na hinihingi. It's an equipment na binili mo through a cash and accounts payable. So ang kailangan nyo lang gawin is, alam nyo dapat yung journal entry. And then, you just plug it in. So equipment, you know that a debit increases that. So equipment of 100,000, magiging 145,000. Yung cash, credit siya. So 108,000 minus 21 will give you your cash balance. And then your accounts payable, 20,000 credit. So that's gonna be 20,000 plus 24,000, magiging 44,000. So for that second error, it's 87,000 for cash, 145,000 for equipment, and then 44,000 for accounts payable. And then finally, the last is yung difference lang. So yung accounts receivable mo raw of 85,000, ang nangyari doon, 55,000 of those was debited incorrectly. So dapat ang dinebit mo lang would be 5,500. Pero ang na-debit mo is 55,000. So ano yung difference? The should be amount is 5,500. What was posted was 55,000. So technically, over ka of 49,500. Na-over debit ka of 49,400. So now, if na-over debit ka, you have to subtract your 85,000 by your 49,500 to give you your account. And that will make it balanced. And then, the second portion, dito papasok yung understanding of trial balance. Na, kung alam niyo yung trial balance, and alam niyo naman na net income lang yung hinihingi, you just focus on the lower portion so that it could help solve 260,000 minus 104 and minus 45 will give your net income of 111,000. And with that, we're done with level 2. We're halfway done for the exam tomorrow. Chapter 2 talks about, number 1, we start with journal entry, then we post, then we make our trial balance, and then we make our 3 income statements. Right now, I know parang review pa lang of everything that we've discussed, pero hopefully, since second iteration na natin to, mas nag-sink in na sa inyo. Are there any questions? Kindly thumbs up if everything's okay. Now's the time for you to DM me kung may questions in any of the exercises na I have discussed. So kindly thumbs up if everything's okay, and then we can proceed. There, good. Yeah, go lang. I think there's a question. Okay. So there's no 4.2 pa in Oble. Sige, we'll double check and then we'll upload later. Thank you for telling me. I'll double check na lang yung 4.2. Okay. So with that, we can now move on to number 3. So for 4.2, in this one, I'll upload automatically now. Kulitin niyo ako pag hindi ko na-upload kaagad, right? So, okay, good. So now we can go to chapter 3. And for chapter 3, based on the quiz performance, there's only 2 scenarios. Either alam nyo yung accruals and deferrals or nahihirapan kayo sa accruals and deferrals. The thing that I really want to emphasize would be accruals and deferrals will make or break your exam. A lot of the questions that needs complex understanding will revolve around accruals and deferrals, meaning mas ma-overwhelm kayo. Not because mas maraming tatanong or something like that. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is mas nakaka-dishearten kapag na-overwhelm kayo for an accruals question. So, in chapter 2, the one na I want you to redo would be Hyrule Services, the Wes Anderson one for the quiz, the Fearless Studio for the quiz, and then the Hype Boy Studio for problem set 2, right? So, yung 4 lang na yon for chapter 2. For chapter 3, it's a different scenario na if you have time, I suggest you redo all the exercises in number 3, in chapter 3. Because, please, if there's anything na mastery na you need to overcome, it's accruals and deferrals. But, let's break it down, right? So, that's the purpose of this review. Let's break it down. Let's first start with the theory portion, right? So, if chapter 3, talagang hirap na hirap kayo, the least you can do is perfect the theory portion for chapter 3, right? In the chapter 3 portion, the first thing that you need to know is the time period assumption. So, babalikan natin yung 4th assumption. And ang importante sa time period assumption is that the economic entity basically divides the economic life into artificial periods in order for it to present the information consistently year in and year out. So, ang importante lang sa time period is for you to understand na we break the economic life into artificial time period, wherein you have period 1, and then you have period 2, and then you have period 3. You break it down. Every period, gagawa ka ng income statement, balance sheet, changes in equity for period 1, period 2, period 3. Nagkakaproblema tayo in accruals and deferrals kasi may mga transactions na tumatawid between periods. May cut-off date, tapos tumawid siya. And that's the purpose of accruals and deferrals. But before we go to that, mag-ipon ulit tayo ng points in terms of theory. Ano yung other important concepts we need to learn? Number 1, we need to be able to distinguish cash basis versus accrual basis, right? And basically, ang sinasabi lang natin, net-net, is that accrual basis records upon the occurrence or the incurrence of our revenue and expense versus sa cash basis kapag nagkakaroon lang ng cash. So, going back to Kevin Trin, lahat ng journal entries na may involved na cash, pareho lang. So, the June 1, the June 3, and the June 19 are all the same entries. Kahit cash basis or accrual. Nagkakaiba lang if walang cash component. Like, nag-purchase ka ng equipment on account or nagkaroon ka ng service revenue na binil mo lang, which is an accounts receivable. So now the question is, we understand we're gonna go for accrual basis kasi mas accurate siya eh. When do you recognize revenue? When do you recognize expense? For revenue, para hindi kayo mahirapan, you only recognize revenue kapag na-perform mo na yung obligation mo. Right? Kapag na-perform mo na yung obligation mo, mag-recognize ka na ng revenue. For expense, the super important principle to note would be the matching principle. So matching principle just states that your expenses should be recognized in the same period a relevant revenue is recognized. Right? So, what is that saying? Bumalik tayo dun sa Coolray example. Bumili ka ng car costing 800,000. Balak mo siyang ibenta at 1.2 million. The matching principle states na if in year 1, hindi mo nabenta, the 800,000 is not an expense yet because there is no revenue. It is an inventory first. Pag nabenta mo na in 2022, may nakuha ka ng revenue, you match the expense na relevant, kaya may expense ka of 800,000. So, gagawin mong expense yung inventory. So, matching principle just states that expenses should be recognized in the same period a relevant revenue is recognized. So, now, we can finally, in good conscience, go to the first out of the 4 special entries that we'll be learning for chapters 3 and 4. The first one would be adjusting entries. So again, theory muna tayo. Adjusting entries, closing entries, required. Adjusting entries, closing entries, required. Reversing entries, optional. Correcting entries, avoidable, meaning ideally, kung hindi ka magkamali, you don't need correcting entries. But technically, you're required to correct it, right? So again, please master the 4 types of journal entries, right? So, kung hindi ka confident sa accruals, hindi ka confident sa deferrals, at the very least, please commit to me that you can do adjusting entries, closing entries, reversing entries, and correcting entries, right? So, let's go to adjusting entries. Basically, adjusting entries are created during the last day of the accounting period. Because yung trial balance, so remember, the first trial balance we learned, gagawin mo siya after mo mag-journal entry for the month. However, there are some events that are too time-consuming to keep track of every day, or they expire through passage of time like equipment, or some items may be unrecorded like accounts receivable, expenses. So therefore, we need to adjust. And for us, the very first thing that you need to know is may two types tayo. Deferrals, or what we call prepayment, and accruals, which we call incurrences. So, I understand this slide, mahirap i-memorize. Pero the idea lang here is, deferrals, may cash component kang matatanggap now, and then dine-defer mo yung pag-recognize ng revenue and ng expense. On the other hand, sa accrual, nagre-recognize ka now ng revenue or expense, tapos magpe-pay later ka or receive later ng cash. So for me, dun sa mga nahihirapan, ang i-memorize nyo are the items under each. So sa deferrals or prepayments, ano yung mga kailangan nyo i-memorize? Consumption of supplies, prepaid rent, prepaid insurance, lahat ng prepaid expenses, and depreciation of equipment are all deferrals. They are prepaid expenses. Again, so ano yung i-memorize? Ano yung mga deferrals? May prepaid expense ka wherein you pay the cash now and then defer the recognition of the expense later. And under prepaid expenses, you have consumption of supplies, prepaid rent, prepaid insurance, prepaid cleaning, and then the depreciation of your equipment. On the other hand, the next type of deferrals is sa revenue, wherein you receive cash now, pero you recognize the revenue later. And ano yung important dito? Unearned service revenue. Yun lang. Unearned service revenue is a deferral. So yun lang i-memorize nyo. Deferrals are prepaid expenses, so consumption of supplies, depreciation of equipment under expenses, and then revenue, unearned service revenue. Yun lang. Yun lang ang deferrals. Now, what is unearned service revenue? Please, kailangan alam nyo that the unearned service revenue is a liability. Kaya nga unearned eh. You have an obligation to perform a service before entitled ka to really get the cash that you received in advance. So, ang tip ko sa inyo, kapag nakatanggap ka ng cash in advance, automatic unearned service revenue yon. Pag naka-receive ka ng cash in advance, always think, baka unearned service revenue yon. Right? Kapag nag-pay ka in advance, that's prepaid rent. That's prepaid insurance. So, deferrals yon. So, pag may mga words na in advance, it's a hint na it's a deferral. On the other hand, accruals are basically, isipin nyo lang, may term ba na receivable? May term ba na payable? Pag may term na receivable, may term na payable, that is an accrual. For example, accrued revenues is the easiest out of the four. It's just basically debit accounts receivable, credit service revenue. So please, wag nyo nung maraming nagkakabaliktad ng unearned service revenue and accounts receivable. Ang difference, unearned service revenue, naka-receive ka ng cash, hindi ka pa nagper-perform ng service. Versus, accrued revenue, ginawa mo na, tapos mo na yung service, pero hindi ka pa nababayaran. So, going back to a tutoring example, let's say, ang rate ko is 100 pesos for 5 sessions. An example of an unearned service revenue would be, someone paid me 500 pesos, wala pa akong ginagawa. That is an example na I recognize an increase in cash, but an increase in unearned service revenue, which is a liability, kasi wala pa akong ginagawa. Versus, may tinutor akong student, 5 times ko siya tinutor, pero hindi niya pa ako nababayaran. Technically, I earned that revenue already, pero wala pa akong cash. So that's gonna be debit accounts receivable, credit service revenue. So please, wag kayong malito. And then, accruals, ano lang yung mga mahihirap sa accruals? Bank. So please be an expert in interest. And salaries. Yung salaries yung nagpapahirap rin. Right? So, again, ang tip ko sa inyo, for deferrals, sorry, paulit-ulit. For deferrals, those are your prepaid expenses and your unearned service revenue. And under prepaid expenses, that's the consumption of supplies, the depreciation of equipment, deferrals. Accruals, lahat ng may receivable or payable, isipin nyo na lang, accruals. Accounts receivable, accrual. Salaries payable, accrual. Interest payable, accrual. Right? Bakit ko inuulit-ulit to? Because sayang yung quiz. Because you know in theory that sino lang yung may alternative method? Only deferrals yung may alternative method. And then later in the next few slides, you'll see na as a way to help you, in the 3 items of Lafleur MNL, the first problem, isa lang doon yung deferral, dalawa doon accruals. So technically, if you just put no adjusting entry, that's automatic 4 points. So importante na you know how to classify. So deferrals, again, for the last time, are prepaid expenses and unearned service revenue. Those have alternative methods. Accruals, wala silang alternative methods, right? So deferrals lang yung may alternative method. But, and this is the interesting point na we can study now, yung reversing entries only apply naman to accruals. So, ang iisipin nyo, deferrals may alternative method, accruals may reversing entry. Okay? So, again, reversing entries are optional and they only apply to accruals. So they don't apply to all adjusting entries, accruals lang. So deferrals, on the other hand, have alternative methods. So now, you have to know na may different alternative methods, right? Whether it's a prepaid expense or an unearned revenue. Now, I will defer to you to go back to lecture 3.2 na doon ko in-explain in thorough detail paano yung alternative method. In order to make most of our time, I will answer quiz 3 with you. So for me, erase anything in terms of like your expectations. More than the grade, ang important is kailangan pag lumabas sa exam, accruals and deferrals, kailangan makakuha tayo ng kahit anong, at least more than enough points for us to pass, right? So now, let's test our mastery using the quiz. So kindly give me 1 minute. I'll just refresh my water. If you have questions so far, kindly type it down. Pero kung clear pa naman yung deferrals and accruals, kindly thumbs up. I'll just get water. Sorry. Para lang I can, yeah. Thank you. Wait, kindly give me 1 minute. Okay, sorry. Thank you so much. We can proceed to answering quiz 3. So, for me, I think yung sayang sa quiz 3 is that even in theory, a lot of people were struggling. So, parang the highlight nun is you have to focus on your theory also, right? Especially for your exam. So, in the theory portions of this particular review, parang the reason why I'm emphasizing a lot is so that you don't overlook yung mga important concepts, right? So, with that said, let's test our mastery. So, for this, it's obviously both false because adjusting entries are not optional, they're required, and that they're usually made for the last day of the accounting period. Number 2, okay. So for me, nagigets ko naman why a lot of people hindi nila ma-memorize or naku-confuse sila na pag hindi ko na-record yung accrued expense, is it understated, overstated? It's not intuitive. It takes a lot to memorize. So, ito yung tip ko sa inyo. Pag ganito na failure to recognize repaid expense, accrued revenue, or deferred expense, the way to do it is make a sample journal entry. What's an example of an accrued expense? An accrued expense will probably be, ang pinaka-favorite natin would be salaries expense. So, debit salaries expense, credit salaries payable, let's say 10. Arbitrary number. Gumawa lang ako ng journal entry. Now, I analyze. Kapag hindi ko ni-recognize yung 10 of salaries expense, ano mangyayari sa expense ko? Probably, maka-understate. Kasi kung hindi ko ni-record yung debit expense na 10, it means it lacks 10. So, meaning, understated si expense. In the same way, pag hindi ko ni-record yung salaries payable, I would lack a 10 in my current liabilities. Meaning, understated by 10 yung liabilities ko. So, failure to record the adjusting entry that I just made will give me understated liabilities and understated expense. So, in the future, kapag nahihirapan kayo i-visualize yung multiple choice question, make the journal entry and then kahit hypothetical numbers and then just answer using analysis, right? Next, sino yung walang alternative method? Well, again, deferrals lang ang meron. Therefore, any accrual, which is in this case, buti na lang nakalagay accrued revenue, does not have an alternative method. Number 4, failure to recognize an adjusting entry for prepaid expense. Oh, so again, ang hirap i-memorize. Sige, gawa na lang ako ng prepaid expense adjusting entry. Ano yung prepaid expense adjusting entry ko? And be careful, I'm not talking about initial entry, I'm talking about adjusting entry. So, meron ka ng prepaid rent na nakaset. So, ang usually mag-a-adjust ka is the consumption of rent. So, the adjusting entry would be debit rent expense, credit prepaid rent. So, with that, pag hindi ko na-record yung expense, understated na naman yung expense ko. Pag hindi ko na-record yung prepaid rent, pag hindi ko binawasan yung prepaid rent ng 10, overstated yung assets ko. And therefore, by making the journal entry, rent expense, credit prepaid rent, I'll be able to answer na overstated assets and understated expenses. Number 5, if you notice, to help you, hindi kami naglagay ng depreciation question sa long prob. Pinasok na namin dun sa multiple choice para at least may 25% chance kayo of getting it. Now, ang important is experts kayo sa depreciation. So, paano natin i-solve to? Number 1 is, hindi naman required, pero I always want you to make it a habit na for any accrual or any deferral, the first question is, ano ba yung initial entry ko? you don't have to make the journal entry. You just have to know na may initial entry. And then, to clarify, kapag hirap kayo sa accruals, I'd rather you make the journal entry ng initial entry just so that it helps you visualize it. And then you make your adjusting entry. So, later, pag alam na natin yung sagot, I'll also tell you, be careful of what you put. Kasi minsan may iba, ang nilalagay nila yung initial entry. Yung hinihingi is the adjusting entry. So, anyways, for this, let's answer muna the question. Right? So, a gym bought 5 treadmill machines costing 75,000 each. So, 75 each. So, times 5, that will give me 3,705. So, ang importante dito is that 5 treadmills, 75,000 each. So, my initial entry is debit 375,000, credit cash of 375,000. Therefore, I will now be able to create my solution for the adjusting entry on December 31. First important question, magkano yung total equipment value? Well, it's 375,000. Next, what is its useful life in months? Kung 10 years, 10 times 12 is 120. Now, I will be able to get my monthly depreciation expense of 375. You have your monthly depreciation expense of 375 divided by 120 is 3,125 per month. How many months? Kailan mo siya binili? That's the next question. Kailan mo siya binili? June. So we count. June may depreciation, July, August, September, October, November, December. 7 months worth of depreciation. So 3,125 times 7 is 21,875. And therefore, dapat memorize niyo na how to make the adjusting entry for equipment, depreciation expense, credit accumulated depreciation of 21,875. So, in the exam, if I tell you what is the adjusting entry for this transaction, mali if ang sinulat nyo is this one. Ang adjusting entry lang is debit depreciation expense, credit accumulated depreciation. And now that since we're in the topic of accumulated depreciation is a contra asset account. So, ano ang normal balance ng accumulated depreciation? The normal balance is a credit. It's a contra asset. So, think, ano bang normal balance ng equipment? Debit. What's a contra asset? So, probably, accumulated depreciation should have a normal credit balance. So, please take note of that. Next, we use adjusting entries because some events are too time consuming. That's true. And then, pareho lang yung cash basis and accrual basis because it involved cash. So, pareho lang sila. Right? So, with that said, we now go to problem 1, which is basically the Lafleur MNL. So, as a quick spoiler, number 1 is a deferral. And then number 2 and 3 is an accrual. And therefore, the hope was for you to understand that, apply the theory, and just say na walang alternative entry for numbers 2 and 3. So, ang pina-highlight ng quiz is super important na you understand what are the different deferrals and accruals para alam nyo kung sino yung may alternative, sino yung wala. And for this, let's go first muna with the first statement. So, paano nyo ba i-solve any accrual or any deferral? Honestly, there are 4 steps lang. When you read something, and then it tells you what's the adjusting entry, automatic, isipin nyo, accrual ba siya or deferral? So for this, identify natin. On April 30, naka-receive ka in cash in advance. Oh, in advance. Cash now. That's a deferral. From a client to send a bouquet each month for a total of 2 years. So, analyzing the problem, nakatanggap ako ng cash for a service na hindi ko pa na-provide. That means may liability ako. And that means that's a example of unearned service revenue. Right? So it's an example of unearned service revenue. And to help you, pero this is not the adjusting entry, what was the initial entry? Nakatanggap ka ng cash, pero mag-recognize ka ng liability na ang pangalan is unearned service revenue. Debit cash, 240,000. Now, how do you solve for the adjusting entry? Well, ang nangyayari is, naka-receive ka ng 240,000 on April 30, and then as of that moment, may 240,000 kang liability. But from April 30 or May 1, so may May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December, after 8 months, a portion of that 240,000 should be turned into revenue kasi nakasend ka na ng bouquet for the next 8 months. So how do we solve for it? You compute. You receive 240,000. Ano yung scope of service? Supposedly, each month, you have to send a bouquet for the next 2 years. So, 2 times 12, every month for 24 months, you have to send a bouquet. And for you to do that, they'll pay you 240,000. So technically, what should be your monthly revenue? 240,000, the total amount, divided by the period covered, which is 2 years or 24 months. So you'll have 240,000 divided by the period covered, 24, 10,000 yung monthly income mo. Ilang buwan ka nagkaroon ng na-earn mo yung income mo? From May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December, 8 months. So 10 times 8, 80,000. So out of the 240,000, 80,000 of that is revenue. So 8 out of the 24 na earn mo na. The remaining 16 out of 24, may utang ka pa kasi hindi mo pa nagagawa. So 80,000 is revenue, 160,000 na lang talaga yung unearned. Therefore, my adjusting entry should be, I need to recognize this revenue. Debit, unearned service revenue, nagbawas ka ng liability worth 80,000 so that you can recognize a credit of service revenue 80,000. Okay, let's stop here muna. Are there any questions or clarifications for unearned service revenue? If not, kindly thumbs up kung clear pa yung process. Para hindi tayo ma-intimidate. So normal lang yan. The next question is, do you have an alternative method for unearned service revenue? The answer is yes. Because it's a deferral. So, ulitin natin. Alam natin na unearned revenue siya. Pero ano yung initial entry mo if it's an alternative method? The alternative method focuses on the income statement. So rather than treating it as a liability at the start, you instead treated it as a service revenue. So yung 240,000 at April 30 na natanggap ko, sige, gawin na muna natin service revenue. Sa December, tingnan na lang natin kung ano pa yung utang natin, adjust na lang natin. So ang difference is, you recognized it as a revenue at the start. And then you did your calculations na ang na-realize mo is, shucks, out of the 240,000, 80,000 lang pala yung revenue ko doon. The rest is 160,000 na liability. So now, ang i-adjust mo is, we need to recognize a liability instead. Kasi at the start, you recognize a revenue. So now, you have to recognize the proper liability. So ang i-adjust mo is, instead of this one, itong liabilities. And therefore, your adjusting entry is debit service revenue, meaning pinababaan mo yung revenue mo, not by 80,000, but by 160,000, because that is the unearned service revenue or the total liability that you still owe on December 31, 2020. Right? So, in summary, anong difference ng primary method and alternative method? In primary method, you first recognize it through the balance sheet account. Ginawa mo munang liability. On December 31, in your adjusting entry, you said a portion of this liability was earned as revenue. So now magre-recognize ka ng income statement, which is the service revenue. On the other hand, the alternative method, baliktad. Mag-recognize ka muna ng buong service revenue. Sa December 31, titingnan mo kung ano yung liability mo. And then dun mo lang papalabasin yung liability mo. So please redo this portion, especially the alternative treatment method. Next, number 2, which is supposedly a giveaway, is just, on the other hand, nag-perform ka na ng service, hindi ka pa binayaran. So may revenue ka bang i-recognize? Yes, tapos mo na yung obligation mo. Therefore, this is a accrued revenue na no initial recording kasi hindi mo pa binibill. And therefore, you have to recognize na you earned 360,000. So, ang debit entry mo lang is debit accounts receivable, credit service revenue, 360,000. That's it. Accrued revenue. So, do we have an alternative method for accrued revenue? No, because it's an accrual. Next and last, for Lafleur MNL. Lafleur employees worked until last week of the year. The 2 employees are paid a total of 14,000 a week. Assume that they have a 5-day work week and it falls on a Thursday. So first question sa akin was, Sir, magbabayad ba siya at the end of the year or sa Friday? For salaries expenses, every week sila nagbabayad. They will always pay on a Friday. So yun lang yung kailangan yung isipin. Unless others stated otherwise. But ang meaning lang nito is may cut-off. Magbabayad ka ng Friday. May isang portion of that payment will refer to a 2020 obligation that you have. And then yung another portion is 2021. So this is an example of an accrued expense or salaries payable. So anong gagawin? Walang initial entry kapag accruals. So kailangan lang natin i-understand how much salaries payable should we create or compute. So, ang kailangan natin i-compute is 14,000 and then for 5 days. So, the period covered. So, 14,000 divided by 5 will give you 2,800 per day. Ilang days ka may utang? Nagtrabaho sila ng Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. 4 days. 2,800 times 4 is 11,200. 11,200 is therefore your liability for 2020 December, and then the remaining 2,800 is your expense for January 2021. Therefore, ang i-adjust mo lang is yung utang mo from Monday to Thursday na debit salaries expense, credit salaries payable of 11,200. Clear pa naman so far for salaries payable? Kindly thumbs up if clear naman, so that we can proceed to the next iteration. So now, what happens when you finally pay? So Friday, January 1, Friday, nagbayad ka ng 14,000. So now, tatanungin kita, how much out of those 14,000 was attributed to your December payable? The answer should be 11,200. So the 11,200 out of the 14,000 refers to your December 2020 salaries payable. Now, if I ask you, how much of the 14,000 is how much out of the 14,000 yung expense niya for January 2021? The answer is 2,800. January salaries expense. So, kapag sinabi ko nagbayad ka ng 14,000, ano yung payable? 11,200. That's for December 2020. For January 2021, your total salaries expense would be 2,800. So, in essence, ito yung answer key for Lafleur MNL. So, ano yung mga suggestion ko? For the people that are having a hard time with accruals and deferrals, go back to Emberco. Because Emberco will tell you all the different scenarios, tapos may mga alternative treatment pa siya. So, we already discussed salaries payable. We already discussed accounts receivable. We already discussed prepaid rent. Unearned service revenue. So, yung mga kailangan nyo pang aralin, supplies. So, same concept lang. So, be aware of the difference in terms of like supplies and the alternative method. So, that's your homework. Redo Emberco for chapter 3. Know bakit ano yung difference lang ng primary and alternative method for supplies, given that's a prepaid expense. Know na ano yung how do you depreciate for an account. Kanina may example na tayo, pero I want you to redo it again. And then for theory portion, again, accumulated depreciation is a contra asset account. It's a non-current asset. It has a normal balance of a credit, right? So now, are there any questions for Lafleur MNL and Emberco? Kindly thumbs up if everything's okay. Then we can proceed now to the second and the last problem for the quiz. Okay. So last would be, let's go back to the quiz. And honestly, if I had to be honest, mahirap talaga to. So CDF consulting is hard. And the reason why it's hard is because it's a new format. Pero this is my tip. If it's a new format, and then binigyan kayo ng beginning balance, binigyan kayo ng ending balance, ang knee-jerk reaction na should be, bakit kami binigyan ng beginning and ending balance? Probably, pinapagamit kami ng T accounts. So, as you can see, well, kami, we didn't want to be kupal naman. So, we said, use T accounts. So, tip sa exam, if ever you're lost, and then parang may beginning and ending balance of a certain account, make a T account. So, number 2, please be aware of ano yung ending and beginning. Ito, tinan mo, yung trap is 2023 yung inuna. So, this is ending balance. This is beginning balance. So, be careful, pwedeng ipalitan or pwedeng iba yung currency. So, please be aware of all of those things. So, don't be overwhelmed. Look at each of the required. Right? So, so number 1 would be purchase additional supplies on January 2 amounting to 22,000. Right? So, given the whole idea of this, huwag kayong ma-intimidate. Tumingin muna kayo sa first required. And for the first required, ang kailangan lang nating tingnan is ano ba yung adjusting entry for total supplies. So, the knee-jerk reaction should be, gawa tayo ng T account for supplies. Step 1. Step 2, plug in the given. 2023, 5,000. That means that should be the ending balance for supplies. 2022, that should be the beginning of the supplies. So debit 28,000. So dito papasok yung alam nyo dapat yung normal side of the account. So supplies is an asset, so dapat debit. So ending balance of 5,000 debit. Beginning balance of 28,000. Ano pa yung given? You purchased an additional supplies on January 2 amounting to 22,000. So debit 22,000. Now, my question is, ano yung current subtotal mo? 28,000 plus 22,000 is 50,000. So my total debit so far is 50,000, pero my ending balance should be 5,000. So the answer is, or the question is, 50,000 siya right now. Paano ko siya gagawing 5,000 ending balance? Baka merong credit na 50,000 minus 5, 45,000. And what should that credit symbolize? Pag may credit ka sa supplies, it means may na-consume ka na worth 45,000. So pag sinabtotal mo yan, 50,000 minus 45,000 is equal to 5,000. And therefore, the answer to requirement A is debit supplies expense 45,000, credit supplies of 45,000. Right? So debit supplies expense of 45,000, credit supplies of 45,000. Are there any questions for the T account? Kindly thumbs up kung na-digest, or kindly ask me to repeat it again via DM kung merong questions. Okay. So, I know, parang during the quiz, since bago, parang it's intimidating. But if you really think about it, it's just very straightforward, right? Next. On May 31, ano raw yung adjusting entry? Well, here, we were kind enough not to give interest payable. Basically, ang sinasabi lang namin is, make the adjusting entry kapag interest payable. So, how do you do that? Basically, we go interest payable. That's an accrued expense. So you start off with the 12, what's 12% of 400,000? It's 48,000. But that 12% is an annual interest rate, meaning that the 48,000 represents your interest expense for 12 months. Therefore, we have to get the monthly interest expense. So, paano natin gagawin yun? 400,000 times 12% is equal to 48,000. 48,000 is the yearly interest expense. Divide mo by 12 to get your monthly interest expense of 4,000. And then, how much yung interest na you have to recognize? Well, kailan ba nag-start yung tumakbo, yung utang? May 31 mo kinuha yung note. Therefore, you have an interest that you have to pay for June, July, August, September, October, November, December, 7. So, 4,000 monthly interest expense times 7 will give you 28,000. So, therefore, debit interest expense, credit interest payable, of 28,000. So, that should be 28,000. So, the 28,000 represents 7 out of the 12 that you need to pay for interest expense. There. Are there any questions for requirement B? So we're done now with requirement A, requirement B. Are there any questions If none, the last is requirement C. And ito yung medyo mas mahirap just because kailangan super familiar na kayo of prepaid rent. Basically, ang kwento lang nito is that you have first a T account for prepaid rent. Ang ending balance niya dapat is 177,000. Yung beginning balance niya is 210,000. Now, I want you to think sa mga nag-rent, how does it work? Usually, ang mangyayari dyan is that magpipay ka, for example, for the first 5 months. So, you have a prepaid rent for first 5 months. And then, after mag-expire ng prepaid rent mo, magpi-prepaid rent ka ulit for another 8 months, let's say. So, anong nangyari dito is that the beginning balance of 210,000, may prepaid rent niya as of January 1, 2023. The statement that said, the prepaid rent from the previous year was fully consumed on July 31 means na na-consume mo na yung period covered ng 210,000. So, lahat yon magzi-zero out. May credit ka of 210,000. Naging rent expense na lahat ng beginning balance prepaid rent mo. Ang nangyari is that on August 2023, you entered into a new prepaid rent worth covering 10 months. And then since August mo binili, you probably consumed 5 months. August, September, October, November, December. So, meron kang missing debit, may missing kang credit in order to make your ending balance 177,000. What's the current balance as of July 31 bago mo binili yung bagong prepaid rent? It's 0. Na-zero out mo yung prepaid rent from 2022. So now, how do we solve this? Alam natin na on August 1, you entered into a new prepaid rent worth 10 months. You consumed 5 months worth. And then 177,000 yung ending balance. The first question or the first analysis is, what does the ending balance of 177,000 represent? Anong ibig sabihin ba nitong 177,000? The 177,000 represent the remaining prepaid rent for the last 5 out of the 10 months of the new prepaid rent that you got for 2023. Meaning, 177,000. So, August, di ba? Nagbumili ka ng prepaid rent. So, na-consume mo na yung August, September, October, November, December. Pero, may kailangan ka pang bayaran na January, February, March, April, May. The 177,000 prepaid rent pertains to the remaining period na may January ka pa, may February, March, April, May. Yun pa yung asset mo as of December 31. So, ang analysis 2 is, what is the monthly rent expense? If 177,000 refers to 5 months, 177,000 divided by 5 means that you have a monthly rent expense of 35,400. So kung alam na natin na 35,400 is the monthly expense and we paid for 10 months worth in advance, yung first question sa item C is, how much was the 10-month prepaid rent? Well, that's basically 10 months times the monthly rent expense of 35,400, which will give you 354,000. Next. What is the prepaid rent consumed? Right? So, 354,000, ito yon. Nag-debit ka ng 354,000 on August 1. Pero may na-consume ka nga eh. So, how much? Well, 5 months rent. So, 35,400 times 5, 177,000 rin yung na-consume mo. So, pag chinek nyo, it will balance. So, bakit ang sasabihin nyo? Bakit yung rent expense namin 177,000 tapos yung remaining 177,000 because 5 months na yung consume mo, 5 months rin yung natitira, kaya siya nag-equal. Pero hindi yan mag-equal kung iba yung number. So, supposedly, it was supposed to make the problem easier kasi hinaf namin yung prepaid rent. But, ang important dito is the analysis. So, if you have any questions or if you want me to go back for this, kindly let me know. So, everything clear? Parang naliwanagan ba? Okay, sorry. So, may correction. 177. Ay, sorry. Yeah, it's not 117. Thank you so much. It's 177. Sorry. Thank you so much for flagging. Yeah. And then, mag-a-accept ba kami ng 300,000? For this, in terms of like partial points, honestly, yung department rule was not to accept partial points. So, parang, I think, ganito lang talaga yung interpretation na we'll be able to accept. But, in the interest of points, my request lang is if you have any parang, sir, pwede ba tong partial points? We can talk about it after the exam. So, ang importante more than the points would be, pag lumabas something similar to the exam, you'll be able to answer it. Yun. So, I will be able to answer that question and then correct 177,000. So, other questions for this. So, yun. You have to be careful talaga in terms of how you understand the story of the problem. Yun. Yun. Are there any other questions or okay na? So, I'm assuming since wala na, we can proceed. So, basically, ang point lang dito is that when you truly understand accruals, you can get information. So, as an aside, let's say may bago tayong binigay. Prepaid rent is ng 22-22, ang ending balance is 210,000. Sinabi sa inyo that the rent expense for 2022 is 140,000 and that the monthly rent expense is 70,000. So how many months did the first prepaid rent cover? Yun yung tanong. How do you solve for that? Well, the answer is the 210,000 remaining rent sa beginning balance represents yung prepaid rent mo for the remainder of that particular portion. The 140,000 represents yung rent na na-consume mo already for that particular rent. So if you add those two together, 210,000 plus 140,000, it will give you 350,000 total prepaid rent at the beginning. Now, kung 350,000 siya, total, and ang monthly rent expense natin is 70,000, 350,000 divided by 70,000 is equal to 5 months. So how many months did the first prepaid rent cover? 5. When did it start? November 2022. Right? So again, this is not the same scenario as the quiz. This is just an iteration. I just wanted to highlight na with different information, you can basically solve for the missing information that you need. So dito, ang binigay is ending balance ng prepaid rent, rent expense. Ang ginawa natin, we added that so that we know the total cost of the prepaid rent. So 210 plus 140, 350,000. Divide mo yon by the monthly rent expense of 70, it should give you the number of months. 350 divided by 70, 5 months. And then, paano mo nalaman na November siya nag-start? Kasi ilan na ba yung rent na na-consume? 140,000 means 2 months worth of rent expense. So meaning, working backwards, December, so December, November 1 mo siya nakuha. So, again, baka lang it might be too soon in terms of analyzing. Pero tonight, when you review this reviewer, I want gets nyo tong item na to. So right now, if you have questions, this is an opportunity for me to re-clarify. Kindly DM me now kung clear tong iteration na to. So again, it's not the same as the exam. Not the same as the quiz. I just wanted to highlight this portion. May questions ba or clear naman? Parang na-gets naman. Okay, I can see some people showing okay naman. Okay. So with that said, we're finally done with the quiz. So for me, my last advice for chapter 3 is, okay, be masters at accruals and deferrals. How do you do that? Aside from answering Lafleur, MNL, and this one, answer also Ember code. And then, the second one is to answer Hummingbird spin service. Because, ito naman, ang gusto ko matutunan nyo is how do you find the missing using T accounts. So, in level of priority, parang accruals and deferrals expert nyo muna. And then please just redo Hummingbird para lang make sure gets nyo rather than pinakinggan nyo lang ako on how to solve it. Right? So, please make sure gets nyo to. Just cause super important for you to really understand how T accounts work in terms of finding the missing. So, with that said, yun. So, it will teach you how to work backwards. So, with that said, we're done with level 3. We're finally done with chapter 3. So, sa chapter 3, ang na-add lang is adjusting entries and then adjusted trial balance. Right? So, dalawa na yung trial balance natin. You're on adjusted trial balance, mag-adjusting entry ka so that you will be able to get your adjusted trial balance. So now, the last and final chapter is completing the accounting cycle. So, unlike chapter 3, chapter 4 is again heavy on theory, heavy on concepts, where it's very procedural. So, even with our lecture, the expectation is kayang-kaya nyo dapat anything in chapter 4. Yeah. So, may question here na, sorry, may dalawa palang questions. Okay. So, may clarification on number 3. Sige. For the person that has a clarification on number 3, two things. One, I'll bring it up sa department if we can consider. And then, pag-usapan natin after exam. Number 2, mayroon nagtanong kung may samplex. For me, walang sample exam sa department. The best or the closest na I can do, that's the reason why I'm also doing the reviewer. The samplex supposedly is your problem sets, right? So, for me, kung wala kayong time, just kindly take note of the exercises na I've highlighted para yun yung i-prioritize nyo, right? So, yun, those are my questions. May answers lang or tips for everyone. So, for me, the full accounting cycle, so basically, it's analyze the business transaction, so that's Hyrule services. Journalize the transaction, so Hyrule pa rin yan. And then we learned how to post to ledger accounts. And then from there, we prepared an unadjusted trial balance, our first trial balance. So, PADI consulting. And then we learned how to journalize and post adjusting entries. So this is Ember. And then you get your adjusted trial balance. And then finally, we'll prepare our financial statements. So dapat alam nyo na yung financial statements by now. And then the last step for chapter 4 finally is we have to close and prepare the post-closing trial balance. So again, for me, ang importante sa chapter 4 naman is dapat experts kayo sa classified financial statements. So just know that it enhances usefulness and it's optional to make it classified. Pero dapat, I'll leave it up to you to master and memorize the different definitions for current assets, non-current assets, current liabilities, non-current liabilities, and equity. More importantly, ito lang, yung kailangan nyo memorize. What are current assets? Cash, accounts receivable, supplies, prepaid expenses. Non-current assets, equipment, your contra asset account and accumulated depreciation, intangible assets and long-term investments. For current liabilities, you have accounts payable, utilities payable, salaries and wages payable, interest payable. For non-current liabilities, note payable, and then finally your owner's equity account. So please memorize, commit to me that alam nyo na to kasi it will help you in terms of like finding total balances. Be it parang anong ba total supplies, anong bang total utilities payable, just in case like lumabas siya. Dapat expert kayo in terms of classifying. The next step is for you to familiarize yourself with the worksheet. I think at this point, you don't have enough time to redo a worksheet. So more than doing it, I want you to understand what are the weird parts about the worksheet. So the worksheet, again, is optional. So ano yung optional? Classifying your financial position is optional. Worksheet is optional. Right? Ano lang yung mga weird components ng worksheet na gusto kong i-identify? Once na-adjust mo na yung worksheet, you will do two statements lang. Income statement and statement of financial position. Usually, nagugulo lang yung mga tao in terms of interpreting kung net income ba or net loss. So again, paulit-ulit, I already mentioned this in class, paano mo malalamang net income through a worksheet? Kapag debit siya sa income statement, which looks weird, pero it makes more sense na, credit siya sa statement of financial position. So credit siya sa owner's capital. Therefore, a debit on the income statement and a credit on the statement of financial position will give you a hint na net profit or net income yung account using a worksheet. On the other hand, using this example, you have a credit on the income statement and a debit on the balance sheet. That will tell you na it's a net loss through the worksheet. So net-net, kung nahirapan kayo, tingnan nyo lang yung statement of financial position. If it's a credit, meaning tumaas yung owner's capital, that's a net income. If may debit kayo sa last line item nyo, that should be a net loss because that would decrease your owner's capital. So again, kayo na bahala to master and understand the worksheet. And then finally, we can close the books. So closing the books happens at the end of the accounting period so that we can be ready for the next period. So again, we only close temporary accounts. We only zero out temporary accounts. We don't zero out permanent accounts. We zero out temporary accounts. We retain permanent accounts. So closing entries are required. So what are your temporary accounts? Those that relate to one period. So revenue, expense, owner's drawings, right? And then permanent accounts relate to two or more accounting periods. So assets, liabilities, owner's capital. So with that said, how do we actually close temporary accounts? Honestly, it's just by memorizing the 4 journal entries you have to do. Number 1, closing entry, zero out your revenues. That's always gonna be debit revenue, credit income summary. That's closing entry number 1. Just memorize it. Closing entry number 2, zero out your expenses. Debit income summary, credit the different expenses. Dapat iba-iba ang line item for the expenses. Closing entry number 3, dun ka lang magkakaroon ng difficulty. If it's a net income, it should be debit income summary, credit owner's capital. But if it's a net loss, it should be debit owner's capital, credit income summary. So, yung number 3 lang itututukan natin. Later, I'll help you figure it out. Pero the fourth and final that you should memorize is debit owner's capital, credit owner's drawings. And that should make sense. Owner's drawings decreases your capital. So, debit siya sa owner's capital. Right? So, ito lang yung sasabihin ko sa closing entries. Either be a master at it or don't be a master at it. Hindi pwedeng alam nyo lang yung 2 entries pero hindi nyo alam yung iba. Sayang lang. For me, if takot kayo sa accruals and deferrals, make sure na memorize nyo, master nyo yung closing entries. So, ang mahirapan lang naman kayo is yung sa pag net income or net loss. Now, my tip again, similar with the worksheet, look at your owner's capital. If the owner's capital is a credit, that means ini-increase niya yun. So, net income. So, debit income summary, credit owner's capital is a net income. That's how you can check. On the other hand, if the owner's capital is a debit and then credit yung income summary, that's a net loss. Because a debit and owner's capital decreases it, so that should be a net loss. So, in terms of the landmark case you should visit, it should be the RA capital. So basically, it will highlight ano lang ba yung process natin. So close revenue accounts to income summary, close individual expenses, then finally close your income summary, and then close your owner's drawings. So as you can see, go back to our lecture kung paano naging ganyan. So it's very procedural, so sayang if you don't take the time to just understand it. Yun. And then it will give you your ending capital balance. So with that said, yung last concepts na lang would be post-closing trial balance. So the third and final trial balance. And what's so special about post-closing trial balance? Puro permanent accounts na lang yung laman. There are no temporary accounts. There are no temporary accounts for permanent in post-closing trial balance. It's all permanent accounts. So the last so thank you so much for the patience. So last 15 minutes, yung dalawa na lang natin kailangan gawin is reversing entries and correcting entries. So last na. So honestly, it's gonna be a 2.5-hour reviewer. So my suggestion is after this, do the exercises I told you. And then before you sleep tonight, just 2 hours, 30 minutes, just go through this whole lecture again with me. Take note lang of the theory, take note of the exercises, answer it with me, and then you'll be good for the exam. So please have a good night's sleep then. Right? So, patapos na tayo. Reversing entries na lang. So again, reversing entries are optional and only refer to accruals. And they only are usually made on the first day. So again, sa deferrals, my alternative method. Sa accruals, my reversing entry. For this, the idea lang is the reversing entry just simplifies your entry pag nagbayad ka ng salaries payable. So, kapag nag-reverse entry ka, simple na lang yung entry. Pero pag hindi ka gumamit ng reversing entry, magiging compound journal entry siya. Yun lang. That's it. And for this, what you need to focus on would be Stein's agency for the reversing entry, particularly requirement B. Yun lang, requirement B lang. Wherein it's asking you to prepare the reversing entries on January 1. So, ang question lang naman dito is, what were the adjusting entries made? So, how do we solve for that? Number 1, makikita mo in Stein's agency na merong 5,000 na inaccruing service revenue. So, accrual. So, debit accounts receivable, credit service revenue of 5,000. What's the next one? Nag-accrue rin siya ng interest expense of 2,200. So, debit interest expense, credit interest payable of 2,200. So, ano yung reversing entry? Literally, babaliktarin mo lang. So, for adjusting entry number 1, the reversing entry is Yung AR, gagawin mong credit. Yung service revenue, gagawin mong debit. So the reversing entry is debit service revenue, credit accounts receivable of 5,000. Next, for the interest expense, it's literally credit interest expense 2,200, debit interest payable of 2,200. Literally, nire-reverse lang niya. And that's it for reversing entries. Know your adjusting entry and then i-reverse mo lang. It only applies to accruals. That's it for your reversing entries. So are there any questions? Kindly thumbs up if everything's okay so that we can finally end with the last one, which is just correcting entry. So, okay. So I think we're good. So I'll give lang 1 minute again for people to just ask questions. I'll just get water again. Thank you. So last would be correcting entries. So for correcting entries, basically it's avoidable. But anytime you spot an error, you have to correct it. And if Stein's agency and yung Golf Sensei yung sa chapter 4, the last one that you have to look into, would be Christine Justo CPA sa BTS cable. If you're able to do this, and since I was informed na baka some people haven't seen the YouTube link for 4.2, I'll answer this with you just to highlight the correcting process, right? So for this, nagbigay lang ng trial balance and then you have to correct 5 errors. So basically, maraming different kinds of errors. Pero again, all you have to do is determine what is, ano ba ginawa niya, what should be, ano ba dapat. And then you have to reverse the wrong, make the correct entry. So reverse the wrong entry, and then make the correct one. So here, basically, ang ginawa lang niya is debit cash AR, credit AR 950, pero dapat 590 lang, hindi 950. So honestly, tama naman siya sa names of the accounts. Ang magkakaiba lang is yung correct entry. So now we analyze. Yung cash, it's at 950 right now when it should be 590. So it's overstated. Same with accounts receivable. Therefore, we just debit AR, credit cash of 360. Paano nakuha yung 360? $950 minus 590. 360. Next, a payment of 75 for advertising expense was entered as a debit to miscellaneous expense and a credit to cash, 75. So ito naman, it's a kind of mistake na what they did was nag-debit sila ng miscellaneous expense when it should be advertising expense. So basically, ang gagawin mo lang is i-credit mo si miscellaneous expense and then you make the debit of advertising expense of debit advertising expense of 75, credit miscellaneous expense of 75. Great. And then number 3, the first salary payment this month was for 1,900. Ang ginawa niya is that salaries, wages, and expense, 1,900, cash, 1,900. Pero, what they should have done instead is nag-recognize sila na may portion nun na payable. it should be salaries, wages, and expense, 1,200, salaries, wages payable of 700, and then credit cash of 1,900. So, ano yung correcting entry natin dito? Ang correcting entry natin would be, salaries, wages payable of 700 and salaries, wages, expense of 700. Right? So, for me, again, it looks complicated, but if I can just grab an Excel, so for this, so ang ginawa niya kasing mali is salaries, expense, and then this is just 19, then this is cash, 19, and then dapat ang ginawa niya is salaries, expense, salaries, payable, and then cash, and then this is 1,2,700 and 19. So basically, this is the wrong, and this is the right. If you're experts at analyzing, you can just jump straight to yung sagot na salaries payable. So ang correcting entry is salaries payable, salaries expense. Sorry. Of 700. So that's the correct answer. Now, for the people na parang ayaw nag-analyze, for me, I won't take it against you if what you do is you reverse the wrong. So, cash, 19, salaries expense, 19. And then, you do and then you make the right. So, make the right meaning, copy this lang. Right? And then, by doing that, what will happen would be, pagbabanggain mo lang. So, cash, nag-debit ka ng cash, nag-credit ka ng cash. So, magka-cancel out. Right? So, wala kang cash dun sa combined journal entry. Salaries expense, so parang ganito yung magiging itsura niya. If you combine these two statements, it would look like this. Cash, 19, salaries expense of 12, salaries payable of 700, and then you have cash, salaries expense, ₱19, and then you have cash of ₱19. Magiging ganito. So basically, ang ginawa ko lang is I reverse the wrong. So this is the wrong. Then reverse ko lang siya. And then I made the right. And then, kinombine ko lang. So yung debit nito, kinuha ko. And then yung debit nung correct the right, kinuha ko. And then ito yung credit nung wrong. And then ito yung credit nung right. Gets naman so far. So basically, I reversed the wrong, I made the right, kinambine ko. Gets pa so far? Kindly thumbs up kung gets pa. Or, okay. Parang gets naman. Okay. And then, medyo weird pa siya, right? Because it has redundancies. So, ang gagawin nyo is, okay, debit cash, credit cash, that offsets. So, I'll just copy this. So, nag-offset. Wala na yan. And then, ano pa yung mga redundancies? Itong salaries expense at salaries expense, sino mas malaki? Yung credit ng salaries expense na 1.9 or yung debit na 1.2? Kindly comment kung sa chat lang, quick, kung credit or debit yung mas malaki. And how much yung laki. Para lang I'm medyo assured na nakaka-follow ba kayo. Like pag pinagbangga natin yung salaries expense debit of 1.2 and the salaries expense of debit of 1.9, ano yung mas malaki? Is it like a credit or a debit? Correct. So it's a credit of 700. So mawawala to. And then magiging 700. So if you look, pareho lang siya nung right answer. So this one involves multiple steps, pero hindi siya kailangan ng analysis. Unlike yung ginawa natin kanina na may analysis. So what I'm saying lang is, for correcting entries, parang either you analyze or gawin nyo lang yung reverse the wrong, make the right, ipag-combine nyo, and then eliminate lang the redundancies, and then you'll still arrive with the same answer. So again, let's try it again. One last time. The purchase on account for a printer costing 310 was recorded as a debit to supplies and a credit to accounts payable. Anong ginawa niya? Debit supplies, accounts payable, credit AP 310. When in fact, it should be equipment, accounts payable. Well, madali lang to. Basically, ang gagawin mo lang is mali yung supplies, so you have to recognize it. So, credit supplies. And then, dapat mag-recognize ka ng equipment. So, debit equipment, credit supplies. Yun lang naman. And then, ito. So, cash payment for repair. So, ito naman, ano yung mistake? Ang ni-record niya is debit equipment, credit cash 69. When in fact, it should be miscellaneous expense, cash 96. So, using those two entries, let's try to guess ano yung correcting entry without even analyzing. Literally, ito lang yung ginawa ko. What is the entry made? What should be? So, let's copy that. And then, for the last item, for chapter 4, let's just try and see kung tama ba yung other method natin. So, view. Okay. Okay. So, first is we reverse the wrong. When you say reverse, cash, equipment, binaliktad mo lang. 69. And then please ignore na lang. Or sige, fine. I'll make this dollars. So, be careful for currencies. Dapat same yung currency. So, I reverse the wrong. So, this is the wrong. Ni-reverse ko lang. So, reverse. And then make the right. The next step is we combine. What do we mean by combine? I-list down nyo muna yung debits together. So, dito na natin sa gitna. So, debit. credit, credit. So, meron kayong weird. So, anong pagbabanggain natin? There's the same cash and na debit and credit. Sino yung mas malaki? Well, the 96 cash is bigger than the 69 na debit. So, it should be a credit. Pero by how much? The difference. 96 minus 69. So, ang gagawin ko is I will eliminate. So, let's copy this. How do we turn it into a simpler form? Ito is 96 minus 69. Credit cash of 27. So, tatanggalin ko na to. And then, wala na nagkaiba. So, this is my answer. Debit miscellaneous expense 96. Credit equipment, credit cash of 27. No analysis needed. Let's see if that's correct. Miscellaneous expense, debit 96, credit equipment of 69, credit cash or 27. So for me, pag correcting entries, ganun lang. And then of course, ito lang yung mga correcting entries for the Jim Justo PTS. And then just applying it so that you can have a corrected balance. So, yeah. So, nandun yun sa 4.2. So, ganyan lang yung process. There. So, honestly, that ends our mid-module 1 review. Thank you so much for everyone for sticking through it. So, it's a 2-hour, 40-minute reviewer. But, hopefully, parang if you're coming in blind, kung parang feeling nyo you'll get 0 points, I designed a reviewer na if you can commit to do the following. Number 1, answer all the exercises again of what I mentioned for chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4. You'll do well. So, that's 1. And then number 2, before you sleep tonight, for the last 2 hours and 40 minutes of your day, just go back to this reviewer, highlight lang what I highlighted, go through the same exercises again, this time mas may familiarity, mas may understanding, and then you go to sleep for at least 6 hours and come in early, mga 8:30. I think that will be your best chance of doing your best for 99.1 module 1 exam. So again, at the end of the day, just the first module exam out of the 3. So, pero syempre, let's try to start strong. Are there any questions, Anton, April, James, Margo, Asia, Vicky? Yun. Thank you so much for staying. So commitment. So actually, this is what I'll do now. I'll upload the PDF format for this one kasi at least mas manageable siya. Number 2, I'll upload the video recording within 10 minutes of this video recording call ending, and then I'll summarize sa Facebook. Are there any questions? If not, kindly thumbs up if everything's okay. Okay. So with that said, thank you so much everyone. Good luck. May questions ba kayo? If you want to consult, I'm free again after this. But I'll officially end the recording now.